Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a quiet journey into the hushed corridors of Victorian England, a time of candlelight and corsets, horse-drawn carriages and gaslit streets, embroidered gloves and unwritten rules. Beneath the polished surface of etiquette and propriety, a different tale was stitched into the fabric of daily life. One not of grand romances or sweeping proposals, but of silences too heavy to bear, expectations pressed tightly against the chest, and a courtship culture that often felt more like a performance than a partnership. This story is about why dating, if it could even be called that, sucked in Victorian England. Across 24 parts, we'll slip gently into the lives of those who sought affection amid a world of social contracts, reputations, and rituals so intricate they often left the heart stranded. Let's close our eyes, slow our thoughts, and drift into the first chapter of this quieter, forgotten history. It was the spring of 1847, and the sycamore trees lining Grosvenor Square unfurled their young green leaves into a pale, yawning sky. The wind blew softly through London, carrying with it the scent of rain and soot, of horse manure and fresh bread, of lilies in the market stalls, and varnish from the carriages rolling over cobbled streets. Somewhere behind a tall, soot-darkened window pane, Eleanor Marston sat with her fingers tucked tightly into her lap, her back straight, her eyes lowered. She had turned 17 last month, and was, by all standards, entering the realm of courtship, a term that felt less like a doorway to love, and more like stepping onto a polished stage where one misstep could spell ruin. Her family, modestly situated among the lower rungs of the gentry, had spent the last 3 weeks preparing her for what they called presentation. There would be dance cards to fill, gloves to match with gowns, and more importantly, conversations to navigate with a precision that left little room for sincerity. Eleanor had never been kissed. In fact, she had never even been alone in the same room with a man who wasn't her father or brother. The idea of romance, whispered behind fans and veiled glances, lived more in her imagination than in reality. In the stories her governess had read aloud by the fire, pages filled with dashing men and women fainting with desire, love was a matter of destiny. But in her mother's tight-lipped lessons, it was a matter of decorum, alliances, and enduring whatever must be endured. That evening, as the family's maid laced her into a gown of faded lavender silk, Eleanor felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like the shawl she would wear against the chill of the drawing room. The event was small, a musical evening hosted by the Pembrokes, a family of distant connection and greater means. But it was still a beginning. When she arrived, the house was warm with candlelight and the smell of beeswax and overripe roses. A violin sang from a corner, its notes like soft weeping, while voices murmured in carefully measured tones. She kept her eyes down as she was introduced to gentlemen whose names she promptly forgot, their bows precise, their smiles fleeting. One of them, Mr. Godfrey Blakemore, was perhaps the only one who looked her in the eyes with something other than disinterest or calculation. He was taller than most, with a shock of dark hair and a smile that felt, if not warm, at least alive. But even then, their conversation was no more than a series of rehearsed pleasantries. "Do you enjoy Schubert?" he asked, referring to the music. "I have heard only a little," she replied softly, "but I find it melancholy in a pleasant way." His eyes lingered on her for a moment, and then he nodded, offering a small, unreadable smile. "As do I." That was all. They stood together for less than 5 minutes, never once alone, never once allowed to speak freely. Every word was supervised by the social structure that stood like an invisible chaperone at their side. And when the music changed and her name was called for a dance, Eleanor moved away, leaving behind a silence she could not quite define. This, she would come to understand, was the dance of Victorian courtship, a choreography of manners and masks. Every letter was read by someone else before being delivered. Every encounter was observed, recorded, judged. One was not courted for love. One was selected like a rose clipped from a bush, judged by its outward bloom. There were rules for everything. A lady could not call upon a gentleman. A gentleman could not call upon a lady unless invited by her parents. Dancing more than twice with the same partner signaled intent, sometimes even engagement. A touch too long, a laugh too bright, a glance too warm. Any of these could lead to scandal. And beneath it all, there was the constant awareness that reputation was more fragile than porcelain. One whisper could undo years of careful breeding. One rumor could sink a family. Eleanor's world was not cruel in the way one might think. No one shouted. No one struck. But there was a quiet cruelty in the way affection was filtered through layers of performance, until the heart itself was barely audible. Feelings had to be muted, veiled, dressed in layers like the women themselves. Desire existed, of course, but it hid behind lace and silence. She returned home that night with aching feet and a headache from too many voices saying too little. Her mother said she had done well. Her father kissed her forehead with the absent mind of a man who believed he had fulfilled a duty. Her younger sister, Clara, asked if anyone had fallen in love with her, and Eleanor smiled softly, unable to explain why the question made her throat tighten. That night, she lay awake in her small room beneath the eaves, the gas lamp outside casting a wavering shadow across her ceiling. The wind rattled the pane, and somewhere in the distance, a carriage rolled past. She thought of Mr. Blakemore's dark eyes and the way he had looked at her. Not with love, not even with desire, but perhaps with curiosity. And in this world, that was enough to stir something uncertain within her, because in Victorian England, curiosity was dangerous. It was the first step toward wanting something more. The morning after the Pembrokes' gathering dawned softly, with the kind of muted gray light that never quite decided whether to become day or linger in the comfort of dawn. Rain tapped gently on the windowsill, a soothing, unhurried rhythm that seemed to hush the bustling heart of London before it had time to wake fully. Eleanor lay beneath her embroidered coverlet, her eyes open, tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling, as the memories of the night before replayed quietly in her mind. The lavender gown hung from a hook on the wardrobe, its skirts now slightly wrinkled, and its hem dirtied by a careless step into a puddle on the garden path. It had once belonged to her cousin Rosalind, who had worn it for her own debut 3 seasons ago. Eleanor's mother had altered it carefully, stitching fresh lace along the neckline and adding a new satin sash in the color of violets. It was, by all accounts, a respectable gown, modestly elegant, and suited to a girl of Eleanor's standing. Still, something about it made her feel less like herself and more like a mannequin being presented in a shop window, an object to be assessed, then accepted or declined. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Her father had left early to attend a meeting with a local alderman about canal routes in Essex, and her younger brother Charles was still fast asleep, tangled in sheets and dreams. That left only Eleanor, her mother, and Clara, seated at the long oak table in the dining room with its floral wallpaper and stiff-backed chairs. "You danced with Mr. Blakemore, did you not?" her mother asked, slicing a boiled egg with care. "Yes, once," Eleanor replied, reaching for her teacup. "Only once." Her mother's voice carried no accusation, only observation. "He's the nephew of Lord Winterbourne. Quite the match if he takes a liking." Eleanor stirred a touch of honey into her tea, watching the golden thread disappear into the milky warmth. "He was polite." "That's rarely the point," her mother murmured, then added gently. "Politeness is the beginning. But remember, you must give him reason to remember you. Don't let yourself fade into the wallpaper, dearest." Clara giggled, swinging her legs beneath the table. "Eleanor never fades. She reads too many novels to ever be boring." Her mother gave the child a mild look. Books are well and good, but one must not confuse them with real life. Eleanor said nothing, though a part of her wanted to ask what real life she was supposed to model herself after. The endless succession of parlor visits, the hushed critiques of other girls' gowns, their hair, their mannerisms, the matchmaking that often seemed more like a transaction than anything resembling affection. That afternoon, a calling card arrived on a silver tray, stiff parchment with the neat, black-inked name of Mr. Godfrey Blakemore. Eleanor's heart gave a small, involuntary flutter, though she quickly subdued it. A gentleman's card was never a declaration. It was merely a request, a polite knock on the outer wall of a fortress. Her mother examined the card closely, then allowed a small nod. "We may receive him on Thursday, no earlier. It must not seem too eager." And so Thursday became a fixed star in Eleanor's week. The days that followed were quietly anxious, filled with the tightening of corsets, the brushing of curls, and the rehearsal of safe topics. What books might one mention without appearing too forward? What compliments should one return, and which should be received with demure silence? The act of preparation became a sort of ritual, half prayer, half performance. When Thursday finally arrived, it brought with it a breeze that rustled the lace curtains and made the room smell faintly of damp stone. The drawing room was prepared with exacting care, fresh flowers, polished brass, and a tea service that had once belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. The housemaid had been instructed to remain within earshot, but not in sight, and Clara was sent upstairs with a promise of sweet biscuits if she did not interrupt. Mr. Blakemore arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, dressed in a dark tailcoat and gloves of gray suede. His hair was neatly combed, though a single strand had escaped its place near his temple. He bowed to Eleanor's mother and then turned to her with that same calm, assessing gaze. "Miss Marston," he said with a hint of a smile, "it is a pleasure to see you again. And you, Mr. Blakemore." They spoke of music first, always a safe topic, and then of gardens, books, and the weather. Eleanor was careful, as she had been taught, to avoid anything that might seem too serious or too emotional. She laughed at the proper moments and kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. He was, she noted, more at ease than she had expected, occasionally letting slip a wry comment or an amused glance that suggested he was aware of the artificiality of it all. Once, he paused in the middle of discussing the opera, looked at her for a moment too long, and said, almost thoughtfully, "I imagine you don't much care for all this." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "The opera?" He shook his head slightly. "The ritual, the rehearsals, the dance of it." She hesitated. Her mother was still present, her attention fixed on her embroidery, though her ears were likely attuned to every word. "I find it difficult," she said at last, softly, "to know what is meant and what is merely custom." Mr. Blakemore's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if something unseen had aligned. He nodded just once. When he rose to leave, he bowed again, and this time there was something quieter in the gesture. Not affection, not yet, but recognition, perhaps. After he was gone, her mother said, "You handled yourself well. He may call again. That would be acceptable." Eleanor said nothing, her thoughts turning over slowly, like a clock ticking in the dark. That night, she returned to her attic room and opened the small journal she kept hidden behind a loose floorboard. She wrote one sentence. "I think he saw me, not just the girl in lavender, but the person beneath." And in that quiet line, penned beneath a flickering candle, lay the first soft tremor of something real. The days following Mr. Blakemore's visit unfolded with the kind of stillness that only a well-kept house in mid-spring could contain. The Marston household continued on in its predictable rhythm, footsteps over polished wood, the murmur of boiling kettles, the rustle of newspapers being folded, and the occasional faint melody from Clara practicing scales on the pianoforte. Yet within Eleanor, something subtle had shifted. She went about her days with the same practiced composure, helping her mother address correspondence in the mornings and joining her sister for embroidery lessons in the afternoon. But her mind wandered more often now, particularly when she was alone by the window seat in her bedroom, gazing at the chimneys silhouetted against the sky. She found herself wondering what Mr. Blakemore did when he wasn't performing the social ballet. If he, too, found it all suffocating. If he had once, perhaps in boyhood, wanted something very different from what his station demanded of him. But thoughts like that were dangerous, indulgent even. Eleanor reminded herself daily that she had no real knowledge of the man beyond what he had permitted to slip through a few brief exchanges. That single shared glance, that comment about rituals and rehearsals, could have meant little more than idle charm. Still, it lingered. On the following Sunday, the Marston family attended morning service at St. Aelred's, a modest church tucked between two rows of townhouses in Bloomsbury. Its stone walls were veined with moss, and the air inside always smelled of cold wax and aged wood. The sermon, delivered in the deep, sonorous tones of Reverend Emmons, was about discipline in thought and restraint in desire. Virtues that Eleanor noted seemed less like paths to holiness and more like reminders to keep oneself invisible. As she stood with the congregation, her hands clasped before her and the hem of her muslin dress brushing against her boots, her eyes drifted across the pews. A movement near the side aisle caught her attention. Mr. Blakemore. Standing with his aunt, Lady Winterbourne, he was dressed in charcoal gray with a lapel just slightly crumpled, as though he had not stood still long enough for his valet to smooth it. He did not look at her directly, nor did she expect him to. This was not a ballroom, and they were not allowed to acknowledge one another in any way beyond the social minimum. Still, when the congregation began to file out beneath the tolling bell, and Eleanor stepped out into the cold sunshine, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed, not intrusively, but as though someone had quietly noticed her presence and remembered it. Later that afternoon, as the fire crackled in the sitting room, and her father dozed with the newspaper crumpled across his chest, Eleanor and her mother took tea together, the silver pot steaming delicately between them. "You'll have more invitations soon," her mother said, passing a dish of lemon biscuits. "Lady Redstone's spring garden party is next week, and there's talk of a picnic in Hampstead. If Mr. Blakemore is truly interested, he will make himself more visible." Eleanor took a biscuit, unsure how to respond. She did not yet know what she wanted from him, if anything. Affection, perhaps, a kind of understanding. But she also knew that in their world, emotions were rarely allowed to lead. "Do you think he's interested?" she asked finally, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Her mother gave her a thoughtful look over the rim of her teacup. "Men of his kind are always calculating. They must be. He will be considering your family, your dowry, your health, your manner. Everything is part of the equation. If he finds it suitable, he will proceed." It was not an unkind answer, but it struck Eleanor as deeply unromantic. "What about how someone feels?" she asked, aware the question sounded childish. Her mother's lips curved into a tired smile. "Feeling is what you permit once everything else has been arranged." Eleanor said no more. 3 days later, another calling card arrived. This time, it was not delivered in the usual way through the front door, but by a young errand boy who claimed it was to be handed directly to Miss Marston. Startled, Mrs. Marston accepted it herself, then inspected the card. It was Mr. Blakemore's again. Nothing unusual on its surface, but tucked behind it, folded small and narrow, was a piece of cream paper, plain, unsealed. When Eleanor unfolded it later in her room, she found only 2 sentences, written in the same deliberate hand. "There are places where a person may speak plainly. If you care to find one, I will be walking at Gunnersbury Park this Friday at 4:30. Her heart began to pound, not with joy, not exactly, but with the thrill of something quietly forbidden. Gunnersbury Park was just on the edge of town, a stretch of carefully landscaped paths and gently sloping lawns, a place where families picnicked and governesses pushed prams under flowering trees. It was not an entirely private place, but it was far enough from society's stage that the rules softened at the edges. Eleanor kept the note hidden, reading it once more that night by candlelight, her thumb brushing over the ink as though it might reveal more than it said. When Friday arrived, she told her mother she wished to walk with the maid for fresh air, something she was occasionally allowed to do, provided she stayed to well-trafficked areas and returned before 6. She chose her second best dress, the pale blue one with the faint pattern of leaves, and pinned her hair carefully beneath the bonnet. Her heart drummed steadily beneath her ribs as she stepped out with Lizzie, the maid, in tow. By the time they reached the park, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long golden shadows across the gravel paths. Birds chirped lazily from the hedgerows, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of lilacs in bloom. And then she saw him. He stood near the edge of a small grove of trees, his hands behind his back, his gaze turned toward a pond where ducks drifted in idle circles. Eleanor glanced at Lizzie, who had already begun to find a bench nearby, well within view, but distant enough not to overhear. It was understood. These small freedoms, while technically improper, were granted in exchange for loyalty and silence. Eleanor walked toward him, her breath shallow, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable, though there was a slight lift to his brow as if in silent greeting. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure I should. And yet, here you are." They stood for a moment in silence, the warm hush of the park wrapping around them like a veil. "Why here?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Because it's a way," he replied. And because I think you understand things that others pretend not to. She looked down at her gloved hands, then back up at him. And what if I don't know what to do with that understanding? He gave the faintest smile. Neither do I. But perhaps that's the point. And there, beneath the rustling branches and the soft golden light, the first true conversation of their acquaintance began. Not with declarations, but with two people daring to be unguarded. The walk through Gunnersbury Park unfolded with the kind of gentle awkwardness that made Eleanor feel both out of place and more present than she had in months. The gravel path curved gently ahead of them, flanked by low hedgerows and elderflower bushes in bloom, their pale blossoms trembling lightly in the spring breeze. Children's laughter rang faintly from some distant lawn, and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated the quiet. Eleanor and Mr. Blakemore walked slowly, side by side, with just enough space between them to keep propriety intact, yet not so much as to suggest distance. For a long while, neither spoke. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. You said there are places where people may speak plainly, and yet I find I do not know how. Mr. Blakemore glanced at her, his gaze softer than she remembered it in the drawing room. That's the curse of it, isn't it? One becomes so used to speaking in code that when the chance for honesty arrives, the language feels foreign. She turned that thought over in her mind as they continued walking. The path took them through a shaded glen where the canopy overhead filtered sunlight into gold-flecked patterns on the earth. A robin watched them from a nearby branch, head tilted inquisitively. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys the code, she said after a moment. I don't, but I was born into it. He paused. We all learn our roles. I suspect you've learned yours too well. Eleanor gave a faint laugh, more breath than sound. And what makes you think I resent it? You don't look at people the way other girls do. You listen as though the words are not the most important part. They came to a low iron bench, half hidden behind a lilac bush. He gestured to it, and they sat, Eleanor folding her hands in her lap, her bonnet tilted just enough to keep her expression partially veiled. He didn't speak for some time. A breeze stirred the leaves, and the scent of the lilacs hung sweet and dense around them. When he did speak again, it was with less smoothness than before. My family expects me to marry this year. My aunt reminds me of it at least twice a week. There is a cousin, distant but connected, who has all the qualities they admire. Fortune, poise, a good lineage. She speaks French without an accent and plays the harp with perfect indifference. I've danced with her 3 times this season. Eleanor turned slightly toward him. And she is a sculpture, beautiful to look at, but stone all the way through. That sounds unkind. It is, he admitted, but I suspect she would say the same about me. There was a silence again, though not a cold one, the kind of quiet that settles when people begin to understand the outline of one another's thoughts. Eleanor tilted her head. So why tell me this? Because I think you know what it is to be sculpted, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter. She looked down at her gloves, the stitching worn just slightly at the fingertips from use. I do know, she said softly. I think I've always known. From the first time my hair was pinned up instead of braided, from the moment my name appeared on someone's invitation list, not as myself, but as a Marston daughter. There was a long pause, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, it makes it difficult to trust that anyone sees you. He turned toward her then, not with intensity, but with a kind of attentiveness that made her breath catch. I see you. The words were simple, but they felt like something more. Not a declaration, not a confession, but a kind of offering. Eleanor looked away, heart fluttering against her ribs like a trapped bird. You hardly know me. I would like to, she smiled, faint and cautious. I don't know if that's permitted. It likely isn't. A light breeze caught the edge of her bonnet ribbon, tugging it loose, and she reached up to retie it. He watched her hands for a moment, slim, practiced, steady. Then he looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted like cream in tea. I'll be honest with you, he said, his voice quieter now. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I've been told how to act since I was old enough to lace my boots. But lately, it all feels false. The house parties, the polite laughter, the lists of eligible girls. I feel as though I'm playing a role I never auditioned for. Eleanor gave a small nod. And yet, if you stop playing, you lose everything. He looked at her. Not everything. She met his gaze, and for a moment the rest of the park seemed to fade. It was not a moment of passion, nor even of clarity, but one of mutual recognition. Two people caught in a system so elegantly constructed that escape often looked like failure. After a while, they stood and began walking again, their steps slow, their direction unhurried. They spoke little on the return path, but the silence between them was different now, less filled with performance, more like the hush of early morning, when the world holds its breath. When they reached the gates of the park, Lizzie rose discreetly from the bench and fell in behind them, eyes lowered. Mr. Blakemore stopped just before they parted ways. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but if you'd allow it, I'd like to write to you." Eleanor glanced at the maid, then at the street beyond. "Letters must pass through my mother's hands." "I know. Still, I'd like to write." She hesitated only a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then I shall look forward to reading what you write." And with that, she turned, the ribbon of her bonnet trailing gently behind her in the breeze as she walked away, each step feeling less like retreat and more like the beginning of a story not yet allowed to name itself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly among the usual delivery of catalogs and folded invitations. It bore Mr. Blakemore's careful handwriting, a script so deliberate it betrayed the effort behind its elegance. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Her hands hesitated just slightly as she passed it to her mother, who was seated by the window, lacework in her lap and spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose. Mrs. Marston examined the envelope in silence. Then, with the precision of someone used to sorting between acceptable and unacceptable, she slid a silver letter opener beneath the seal. Eleanor watched her face carefully, watched the way her mother's eyes moved across the page, her mouth neither softening nor tightening. When she had finished reading, Mrs. Marston folded the letter and handed it back. "You may respond if you wish," she said simply. "It is polite in tone and shows appropriate reserve." Eleanor took it, heart fluttering at the permission more than the words. She returned to her room before opening it fully, sitting at her small writing desk beneath the slanted ceiling. The light through the skylight cast long, angular shadows across her blotter. The letter was brief. "Miss Marston, I hope this finds you well, and that the spring is not treating your household too cruelly with its damp temperament. I confess I have little reason to write, save that I find myself thinking often of our conversation in the park and the way it felt to speak without audience. I should like to continue that conversation if you are amenable. If not in person, then here, in the quiet of ink and page. With sincerity, Godfrey Blakemore." Eleanor read it 3 times before setting it down. There was no pretense in the letter, no poetic flourishes or declarations, just a quiet request for connection, offered without expectation. And that, perhaps, was what moved her most. Her reply was penned with care that afternoon, beneath the open window where the breeze lifted the edge of the page. "Mr. Blakemore, I thank you for your kind note. Spring has indeed been moody, though our hearth has managed to keep its dampness mostly at bay. I, too, have thought often of our conversation and of the peculiar comfort that honesty affords, especially in a world where it is so rarely welcomed. You may write again if you wish. I will do my best to answer with equal sincerity. E. Marston." She signed it with only her initial, knowing full well that her mother would review the message before it was sent. It was understood. Everything that passed between them must remain within the bounds of social acceptability. But there was still room, just barely, to be herself within those boundaries. In the weeks that followed, the letters became a quiet thread woven through her days. They never arrived on the same day of the week, and they never came more than once a week, as if too much regularity would draw suspicion. But each one brought a measure of lightness to her step, a curiosity that stirred her awake each morning. Mr. Blakemore wrote of books, unusual ones rarely spoken of in polite drawing rooms, essays on solitude, poetry that questioned duty. He wrote of architecture and the way old buildings seemed to breathe through their stone. He asked questions that assumed she had opinions worth hearing, and Eleanor answered with increasing boldness. She told him of her favorite walks and the wildflowers that grew behind the old stable wall. She confessed her fear of being boxed into a life chosen for her, not by malice, but by momentum. She shared a memory of climbing a tree as a child, only to be scolded so fiercely that she never dared do it again. Their letters never once mentioned affection. They never hinted at courtship. And yet beneath every word was the steady beat of something alive, something too cautious to name itself, but present all the same. Her mother noticed the change in her. Not in her behavior. Eleanor remained as dutiful as ever, but in the way her eyes brightened when the post arrived, in the occasional hum under her breath while she arranged flowers or folded linen. There was something softer in her now, and also something stronger, though the distinction was subtle. It was on a Friday, nearly 6 weeks after their walk in the park, that another invitation arrived, this one handwritten by Lady Winterbourne herself. Mr. and Mrs. Marston, you are cordially invited to an informal gathering at Winterbourne House this Thursday at 3:30. Weather permitting, refreshments will be served in the conservatory. Mr. Godfrey Blakemore has requested your presence, and we should be most pleased to welcome your daughters as well. With warm regards, Lady Winterbourne. Mrs. Marston read it twice, then folded it with quiet satisfaction. It seems Mr. Blakemore is making his intentions clear, or at least preparing the ground. Eleanor said nothing. Her stomach fluttered with nerves, not because she feared his company, but because something within her feared being watched again, judged in rooms where honesty had no place. The conservatory would be filled with mirrors and glass, with eyes disguised as politeness. She wondered if he would still speak as he had in the park, or if the role would reassert itself. The days passed slowly until Thursday arrived. Winterbourne House stood just beyond the northern edge of London proper, nestled behind high hedges and guarded gates. The drive was long and lined with chestnut trees just beginning to bud. Eleanor rode in silence beside her mother and Clara, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. When they arrived, the butler ushered them through a vast marble-floored entryway and into the conservatory, a room made almost entirely of glass, filled with ferns and white blossoms, the ceiling arching high above in steel-framed curves. There were other guests, to be sure, distant cousins and neighboring families, but Eleanor spotted him almost immediately. He stood by a camellia bush, dressed in a pale waistcoat, his hair neatly parted, though the same stray strand had again escaped near his temple. Their eyes met just briefly. He did not smile, but he inclined his head, and she knew the room was not theirs, but the understanding remained. Eleanor moved through the conservatory as one might drift through a shallow stream, careful not to disturb the surface too much, but constantly aware of the stones beneath her feet. The air was heavy with the scent of orange blossoms and something warmer, perhaps vanilla or jasmine, rising faintly from the trays of pastries and tea cakes arranged on polished silver. She kept close to Clara, who skipped ahead with the untroubled delight of a girl still too young to be watched for flirtations. Their mother had drifted toward Lady Redstone, whose conversation moved with the speed and elegance of a practiced gossip. Eleanor, for her part, took up a place near a group of potted palms, half hidden by their broad, fanning leaves. From here, she could watch without being watched. Mr. Blakemore was engaged in polite conversation with a gentleman whose posture suggested he found such gatherings necessary, if not particularly enjoyable. Godfrey's replies were pleasant, measured. His expression betrayed none of the liveliness that sometimes flickered into his letters, nor the quiet warmth she had seen during their walk. But then again, neither did hers. There were masks for every occasion. It was some time before they spoke, and even when they did, it was not alone, but in the presence of others, in the kind of stiff, meandering exchanges that filled up space without revealing much. "Miss Marston," he said with a gentle bow, "it is a pleasure to see you again. I trust the journey was not too tiresome?" "Not at all," she answered, her smile polite, her voice just loud enough for nearby ears. The air beyond the city was quite restorative. "Indeed," he said, "Lady Winterbourne takes great pride in her conservatory. She believes beauty can soften the worst of moods." Eleanor looked around at the gleaming glass panes and delicate greenery. "Then perhaps I ought to linger here more often." A subtle glint touched his eyes, but it vanished before it could linger. "I should be glad of that," he said. "Even beauty benefits from good company." And then, just as quickly, the moment was gone, taken by the arrival of Miss Linton and her cousin, both of whom smiled far too broadly and began recounting the story of a scandalously overturned carriage in Mayfair. The afternoon unfolded in that same rhythm. Snatches of conversation, glances shared between sips of elderflower cordial, the occasional brush of presence that never became closeness. And all the while, Eleanor was aware of the quiet tension building. Not a sharp kind, but something diffused, like warmth gathering beneath a heavy quilt. Only once did they find themselves briefly unobserved beneath the iron trellis that supported a climbing rose, its blossoms still tightly furrowed in early bloom. He spoke first. "You were right," he said, voice low. "This place reflects more than it reveals." She looked up at him, the lattice work of sunlight painting patterns across his collar. "Then why invite me here?" "Because sometimes you have to play the part long enough to earn a moment behind the curtain." Eleanor considered this. "Is that what this is? A moment?" His lips curved faintly. "It might be." They said no more because they could not. Voices echoed too easily through glass and marble, and the eyes of society missed very little. But something had passed between them again, unspoken, intangible, and yet undeniably real. By the time the afternoon faded into early evening, and the Marstons took their leave, Eleanor's mind was quiet but restless. The kind of restlessness that had no name, only a shape, like a key turned halfway in a lock. Back home, she removed her gloves slowly, fingertips numb from the tension of keeping her expression serene. She sat at her desk, lit only by the orange blush of sunset through the window, and reached for her journal. He does not look at me the way others do. Not like a future acquisition, not like a curiosity to be measured. He looks as though he is waiting for something, some word, some truth that neither of us is quite brave enough to speak aloud. She paused, then wrote, "What are we waiting for? And who would we become if we dared to reach for it?" Downstairs, the sound of cutlery and conversation resumed as always. The world, with all its quiet expectations, rolled on without pause. But Eleanor sat motionless, the ink drying on her page, knowing that something had begun to stir in her life. Something small and quiet, but too persistent to ignore. And somewhere in a house lit by the same setting sun, Mr. Blakemore likely sat at his own desk, considering the very same thing. The next letter arrived 5 days later, carried not by the usual postman, but by a footman in winter-born livery. He said nothing as he handed it over, merely tipped his hat and departed, the heels of his boots clicking crisply down the garden path. Eleanor was in the drawing room when the letter was brought in, and for a moment she could only stare at the envelope resting on the silver tray. Her mother, seated nearby with her embroidery, raised her eyes just slightly. "Another letter?" Eleanor nodded. "Well," Mrs. Marston said, voice neutral, "see if it's worth answering." The envelope bore no crest, no flourish, just Mr. Blakemore's now familiar hand. Eleanor held it tightly in her fingers as she excused herself and climbed the stairs to her room, closing the door softly behind her. The spring wind had left her window ajar, and the curtain swayed faintly like sails at sea. She opened the letter slowly. "Miss Marston, I confess I thought of writing something light-hearted this time. Perhaps a reflection on the pastries at Lady Winterbourne's, or an amusing anecdote involving a nervous spaniel and an overturned teacup. But that would not be honest, and we have promised honesty, haven't we? I saw something in your face that day, something familiar. Not fear, but restraint. You move like someone waiting for permission. And I write to say what I could not then. You do not need permission to be known. I don't ask anything of you. But I would like very much to know you as you are, without the practiced smiles or cautious silences. If such a thing is impossible, I'll understand. But if it isn't, then I would be very glad to read whatever truth you choose to share. G." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter again. The wind outside stirred the tree branches, and a crow called somewhere across the rooftops. She sat down at her writing desk, dipped her pen in ink, and began to write before she could think better of it. "Mr. Blakemore, what would it look like, I wonder, to be known? I have spent so long curating myself that I'm not sure which parts of me are truth and which are camouflage. But I want to try. I think you are the first person to ask not what I am worth, but who I am. So I will tell you something I've never said aloud. I do not like the way women are taught to measure their lives. Not in years, but in prospects. Not in thoughts, but in silence. We are praised for obedience and patience, but not for curiosity or ambition. I read history in secret, not the kind with kings and treaties, but the kind that speaks of quiet lives, midwives, sailors' wives, women who ran printing presses behind closed doors. Sometimes I dream of a life without corsets or curtsies, not because I despise this world, but because I want to breathe without asking permission. If this confession costs me your regard, I will understand, but I cannot pretend I am someone else. Not with you. E. She folded it, sealed it, and carried it down herself to be sent out, claiming it was a note for a friend in Kensington. Her mother asked no questions, and Eleanor offered no explanation. Days passed, a week, then another. No letter came. The absence was not devastating. There were no tears, no gasps of heartbreak, but rather a slow, quiet tightening in her chest. She carried on as she always had, pouring tea, smiling at the appropriate moments, attending luncheons and walks through gardens still thick with last year's shadows. But within, something remained suspended, like a breath held just past comfort. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang. Eleanor was in the hallway, preparing to leave with Clara for an errand. The maid answered the door, and there he stood, Godfrey Blakemore. No hat, no coat, just a suit of soft gray and a face that bore none of the polished indifference so often expected of men like him. Forgive the intrusion, he said to the maid. I've come to speak with Miss Marston. Clara's mouth fell open. The maid, wide-eyed, turned to Eleanor. Shall I fetch your mother? Eleanor's heart thudded like a war drum in her ears, but her voice remained even. No, please tell her I'll be in the garden. Mr. Ralph Blakemore and I will speak there. She led him out through the back door, past the stone path flanked with wilted daffodils, into the small private garden her mother tended mostly for appearances. The ivy-covered walls shielded them from the neighboring homes, and the hedges muffled the sounds of the city beyond. They stood there, facing one another in the cool morning light. I didn't mean to disappear, he said. Your letter, it was something I needed to think about, to sit with. Eleanor looked down, brushing a loose hair behind her ear. I thought perhaps I had frightened you. He gave a short, rueful laugh. No, not frightened. Humbled, perhaps. You wrote something real, and I've been drowning in falsehoods for so long, I needed time to remember how to swim. There was a pause. I'm not sure what this is, he said. You and I. But I want it to be something that grows, not performs. I want us to write our own pages, not copy from the ones handed down. Eleanor met his gaze, her voice quiet but steady. Then let's begin there. They didn't touch. They didn't declare. But they stood together, not as players in someone else's drama, but as two people who had paused the performance, if only for a moment, to find the truth behind the curtain. And in that moment, the silence between them was not empty. It was full. After Mr. Blakemore departed, the garden seemed quieter than before, as though even the leaves were holding their breath. Eleanor stood alone for several minutes, listening to the breeze stir through the ivy and the faint echo of the street beyond the gate. She pressed her fingers lightly to her wrist, feeling the gentle thrum of her own pulse, a small, steady reminder that something had begun. Not a romance, not yet, but a movement towards something that felt more real than anything else in her carefully ordered world. Inside the house, she expected a storm of questions, but none came. Her mother, it seemed, had taken the news from the maid in stride, perhaps imagining the visit was a polite formality, a gentleman seeking clarity about future intentions. Mrs. Marston said only that Eleanor ought to wear her ivory muslin to Lady Redstone's musicale on Thursday, and reminded her that appropriate conduct always preceded serious offers. Eleanor nodded, said yes to everything, and tucked her thoughts away for later, where they could stretch out in quiet. Later came that evening, when Clara had gone to bed and the house had slipped into its nightly hush. Eleanor sat at her desk, fingers ink-stained and slightly trembling, and began another letter, not for sending, but for keeping. There was a moment in the garden this morning when the sun slipped through the hedge and touched the side of his face. He didn't notice, but I did. It made him look like someone drawn in charcoal, half in light, half in shadow. I wonder if he knows how often he speaks the thing I was afraid I might never hear, that I have value beyond the parts of me deemed acceptable. She paused, then added, We are both pretending less now. and it's terrifying. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the others in her hidden drawer, where the words could rest without fear of being read aloud or misinterpreted. These were for herself alone. In the following days, life resumed its habitual cadence. Eleanor attended calls and accepted invitations, sat through dinners and recitations, always with the same gentle smile that revealed little. But beneath it all, her thoughts drifted off into the garden, to the silence shared between two people who had momentarily stepped outside the rules. The next time she saw Mr. Blakemore was at the musicale. Lady Redstone's drawing room was as opulent as ever, crimson damask drapes, gold leaf cornices, and a chandelier so vast it seemed almost a threat to those below. The air buzzed with conversation, fans fluttered, and the quartet played something by Haydn in the corner, too faint to anchor attention. Eleanor stood with her mother near a table of cordial glasses, her posture impeccable, her expression composed. She did not look for him, but she felt him enter. It was not a dramatic entrance, no sudden hush or grand announcement. But when he stepped into the room, something shifted, as though a draft of cooler air had swept briefly past. He moved through the crowd with practiced grace, stopping to exchange pleasantries with two older ladies and bowing over Miss Cartwright's hand, which lingered too long in his grasp. Eleanor watched from the corner of her eye, her mouth still turned in polite attention to her mother's conversation about a bishop's recent retirement. And then he was beside her. "Miss Marston," he said quietly, "would you allow me the next piece?" Her mother inclined her head with satisfaction. "Of course." Eleanor placed her hand in his, gloved and steady, and let him lead her to the small area that served as a dance floor. The musicians struck up a gentle waltz, and their bodies moved into the slow spiral, practiced and graceful. But the dance was not the point. It never had been. "I thought you might not come," she said softly, her eyes focused on the space just over his shoulder. "I wasn't sure I should," he replied, matching her tone. "But I wanted to see what it would feel like, to move through this room, toward you, knowing why I came." They turned, his hand light at her waist, her palm resting against his shoulder. Their movements were fluid, unhurried. Around them, others danced with more energy, more showmanship, but theirs was quiet, focused. "There are eyes everywhere," she murmured. "I know." "We mustn't speak too clearly." "I don't need to," he said. "You already understand." And she did. It wasn't just the words they'd shared or the letters sent in secret. It was the way he listened, the way he paused before speaking, the way he never once told her who she ought to be. In him, she saw a man who had lived long beneath expectations and who had begun, at last, to resist. The music slowed. Their final turn came. They paused, bowed, and released each other's hands. Around them, applause scattered gently through the room like dust in sunlight. He stepped back, his face composed. She turned away, returning to her mother, her breathing even, her smile unchanged. But something had been confirmed. Not promised, not pledged, but known. Later that night, in the small hours when the lamps had been extinguished and the house slept, Eleanor awoke and sat quietly by her window. The moon was high, bathing the rooftops in silver. She whispered to the dark, not knowing why. "If this ends tomorrow, I will still be grateful for it." Because even the smallest moment of being truly seen was a kind of salvation. And in the quiet corners of Victorian England, salvation came rarely. 2 days after the musicale, a letter arrived from Mr. Blakemore, not delivered by footman or postman this time, but passed discreetly through the hands of a maid who had once been in service to Lady Winterbourne. Eleanor found it placed inside her prayer book, its edges softened from being tucked into worn pages. She waited until evening to read it, when the house had grown quiet and her candle had burned low. The wax pooled beside her hand as she unfolded the note slowly, not smoothing its creases like something sacred. "Miss Marston, there are moments I wish I could preserve, the way a certain silence falls between us, one not born of awkwardness, but of understanding. The kind that allows two people to exist without explanation. I fear that I cannot yet offer a name to what this is, nor would I dare presume what you feel, but I can tell you that you have unsettled something in me, something that has long been hidden beneath expectation and performance." I think I was asleep, Eleanor, not in the poetic sense, truly asleep, numb to the possibility that I might one day want more than a suitable match in polite conversation. But when I speak to you, I feel awake. You are not like the others, and I say that with the highest regard. If you would allow it, I would very much like to walk again, this time somewhere farther from polite eyes. Yours with sincerity, G. She read it 3 times, then pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, she dreamed of trees swaying under a sun that never set and of voices speaking plainly in the warmth of unfiltered air. By the following morning, the plan was quietly made. Eleanor told her mother she wished to visit the bookshop on Russell Street, which she did with regularity. Lizzie, the ever-faithful maid, was instructed to walk slightly behind, as was proper, and to remain outside if Eleanor chose to step into a particular shop for a few minutes of quiet browsing. But she did not go to Russell Street. Instead, Eleanor took the back route through Tavistock Square and emerged near the gate to Bloomsbury Gardens, where the trees grew tall and thick and the gravel path curved out of sight within a shaded grove. It was one of the few public places in the city where the rules could be bent, just slightly, without scandal. Mr. Blakemore was already waiting near the wrought iron bench beneath the old elm. He stood as she approached, but made no movement to greet her further. His expression was composed, but his eyes were softer than usual, less shielded, more human. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Neither was I." They sat. The spring air was cool and laced with the scent of damp earth. A few early bees bumbled lazily between the flowers, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. "I liked your letter," she said quietly. He smiled. "I was afraid it might overreach." "It didn't." She looked down at her gloves, tugging at a thread near the wrist. "You said I unsettle something in you. I think you do the same in me. I didn't mean to." "I know. That's what makes it more dangerous." They were quiet for a long while after that, not out of discomfort, but because neither knew how to say what needed saying. When Eleanor finally looked up again, she found his gaze on her. Not intense, not demanding, just steady. "I have something to ask," he said slowly, "and I need you to know there is no pressure, no obligation." She nodded. "If I were to consider a path that does not involve what has been laid out for me, if I were to speak to your father, not tomorrow, not yet, but one day, would that be something you would welcome?" Eleanor drew a breath. It was not a proposal. It was not even a promise. It was an invitation to consider a world that might one day be theirs. "Yes," she said softly, "but only if it's what you want, not what your aunt requires, not what my mother expects, not what London would applaud, only if it is yours." His smile was faint, and it didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was real. "That's the first time anyone has ever said that to me." They sat side by side as the clouds shifted overhead, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the grass. "I don't want a life where we must hide everything," Eleanor murmured. "But I don't yet know how to live one where we don't." "Then we learn," he said, "together, slowly. Slowly is the only way I've ever known." They parted without touch, without ceremony. Just two people walking away from the bench in different directions, their steps careful, measured, but lightened somehow, each carrying a small, unspoken certainty folded like a note inside the chest. Back at home, Eleanor returned to her journal, to the quiet page that awaited her. "He is not mine, not yet, perhaps never, but I have seen what might be possible when truth is given space to breathe. That alone is a kind of freedom." She set down her pen, closed the book gently, and listened to the soft hush of her heart. It was no longer racing, only steady, like the sound of footsteps approaching from far away. The weeks that followed passed like petals falling from a blossom, slowly, imperceptibly, until the branch stood bare. May arrived with a brightness that seemed almost false, as though the city had dressed itself too suddenly in celebration. London was blooming. The flower markets overflowed, window panes were polished until they gleamed, and the streets were thick with the sounds of hooves and conversation. And yet, beneath the pageantry of spring, Eleanor felt the weight of silence growing. Mr. Blakemore had not written in over 10 days. There had been no new letter, no whispered message through the maid, no discreet encounter arranged through quiet understanding. And Eleanor, though composed as ever, felt that absence stretched like shadow at twilight, long and soft, but growing deeper with every hour. She did not cry. There was no heartbreak, no scandal, no dramatic farewell, but she felt as if something had been paused, or worse, reconsidered. She thought of the last time they met in Bloomsbury Gardens, of the way he'd said slowly and the sincerity in his voice. It had felt like the start of something. Now, the stillness was too loud to ignore. Her mother, as always, observed without prying. But one afternoon, while Eleanor was folding linen in the sitting room, she spoke with a gentleness that made Eleanor stiffen. "It's not uncommon," Mrs. Marston said, smoothing the edge of a napkin. "Young men often find themselves conflicted between intention and instruction, especially those with families as invested as his." Eleanor didn't look up. "You think he's been discouraged?" "I think he's hesitating, and hesitation in a man of his standing is not a promising sign." The words were not cruel. They were not even meant to wound, but they settled heavily in Eleanor's chest. That night, she returned to her writing desk, more out of habit than hope, and pulled the drawer open. The letters were still there, neatly tied with a ribbon, their edges soft from being read and reread. She untied the ribbon and selected the last one. It was the one where he'd written, "You do not need permission to be known." Eleanor traced the sentence with her fingertip, then set the letter aside and reached for a blank page. She didn't plan the words. They simply came. "Godfrey, you once asked to know me as I am, so this is who I am now. Unsure, quiet, but unwilling to vanish into a silence I did not choose. I do not write to demand anything. I write only because not writing feels dishonest. I miss the feeling of being met with sincerity. I miss the sound of your voice when you're not protecting it. I miss the part of me that you seemed to see before I even realized it was there. If something has changed, I ask only that you let it be spoken. Silence is not a kindness. It is a slow forgetting." She sealed it, and the next morning handed it to Lizzie with the same request as always: deliver it discreetly, not through the official post. The girl nodded, her face unreadable, and disappeared into the gray light of morning. 2 days passed, then 3. Eleanor tried not to hope, tried not to look toward the hallway each time the bell rang or a door creaked open. She buried herself in errands and books, in embroidery patterns and social calls that gave no peace. The city felt louder than usual, and yet she heard nothing she wished to hear. It was on the 4th day, while she was walking alone in the garden, that Lizzie approached. The maid's face bore no particular expression, no joy, no worry, just the quiet gravity that seemed to deepen in servants who had seen too many of their betters break under the weight of propriety. "There's something for you," she said simply, and handed Eleanor a folded note. It was not sealed. It bore no initials, just her name, written in a hurried hand. She unfolded it quickly, her heart thudding. "Eleanor, forgive me. I did not mean to vanish. I was summoned to Derbyshire. Family matters, the kind that demand presence more than thought. I meant to write. I tried. But I feared that any letter sent in haste might say too little or too much. I have not changed my mind. I am still where I was, though the world around me keeps shifting. I am returning to London tomorrow. May I see you the day after? I will wait at the small gate on the north side of Bloomsbury Gardens, the same hour as before." Eleanor pressed the note to her chest, eyes closed. The wind rustled through the trees, and a bird landed lightly on the garden wall. He had not forgotten. He had simply been swept away by the world he could not always control. And he was coming back. She returned to the house, her steps light but unhurried. She would not race toward anything. Not anymore. But she would meet him there, just as he asked. Not because she needed reassurance, but because she had never been more certain of what she wanted. The morning of their meeting arrived beneath a sky the color of watered milk. The clouds hung low, but no rain fell, and the air was warm enough to carry the scent of lilac across the garden walls. Eleanor rose early, though she moved slowly through her morning routine, taking care not to reveal anything unusual in her rhythm. She dressed in a gown of soft gray blue, a shade her mother approved of for public appearances, neither bold nor demure, and tied her bonnet with practiced hands. She left just after 3, her steps measured, her maid walking a polite distance behind. From the outside, she appeared every inch the respectable daughter on an afternoon stroll. Inside, her heart moved with the quiet fervor of one holding too tightly to a truth still too delicate to name. By the time she reached the north gate of Bloomsbury Gardens, the breeze had picked up, tugging lightly at her ribbons. The trees overhead whispered gently and the gravel path curved just beyond view. She turned the corner and saw him. Godfrey stood by the old elm bench just as before, his posture as still as if he'd been carved from stone, save for his eyes. Those eyes always watchful, always waiting for something not yet spoken. When he saw her, his face softened, not with a smile, not quite, but with relief. And something else, something like longing, tempered by restraint. They greeted each other quietly, with only a soft Miss Marston and Mr. Blakemore, spoken not because they needed formality, but because they had not yet found a better word for the space between them. They sat, side by side again, their hands folded in their laps, the silence warm and familiar. "I'm sorry," he said at last, voice low, "for disappearing, for not explaining." "I understand," she replied, meaning it. "I was in Derbyshire," he continued. "My uncle is ill, not gravely, but enough to summon the family. My aunt used the opportunity to press certain conversations, ones I did not wish to have. About you," she said, "and about who I am expected to become." He paused, watching a leaf tumble across the gravel. "They have plans, Eleanor, and I am in them, but not as myself, as a version of me that fits the pattern. A house, a wife, children, appearances, contributions to charitable societies, and a marriage, of course, to someone appropriate." She turned toward him. "And you don't think I am?" He looked at her then, sharply, not with offense, but with something like pain. "You are more than appropriate. You are everything I wish for, and precisely what they would not understand." Eleanor held his gaze. "Then what do we do?" He exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet. I only know that the thought of walking away from this, before it's even begun, feels like losing a part of myself I only just discovered." They fell quiet again. The wind stirred the leaves above them, and a pair of sparrows flitted across the path. "I want to continue," he said, "to know you, to write to you, to see you where we can. I don't want to ask for permission anymore, but I also don't want to place you in danger. Your reputation is already fragile," she finished, "but so is everything that matters. Fragile doesn't mean worthless." He turned toward her then, his voice gentler. "May I write more openly? Not foolishly, not dangerously, but honestly." Eleanor nodded. "I would like that. And may I speak to your father in time? Not yet, not until I am sure, but when I can do so with certainty." She hesitated only a moment. Then, "Yes, but only if you are speaking for yourself and not on behalf of what others require." He smiled then, faintly. "That's the only way I wish to speak." They stood together slowly and began to walk, not hurriedly, but with the kind of rhythm that comes from knowing the moment is not fleeting, that something has shifted, subtly but irreversibly. As they neared the garden gate, Eleanor paused. "Godfrey," she said, using his given name for the first time. He stopped, turning toward her. "Whatever this becomes, thank you for seeing me, even when I wasn't sure I could be seen." His expression changed then, softened in a way that made the world feel quieter. "And thank you," he said, "for stepping into the light, even when it must have felt easier to stay hidden." They parted there, with no touch, no lingering glance, just the quiet certainty that the bridge between them had been rebuilt, not in grand gestures, but in small truths. That evening, Eleanor returned to her room as the lamps were being lit across the city, their glow flickering like stars just above the rooftops. She sat at her desk and opened her journal, the ink cool and dark beneath her pen. "We do not yet have a future, but we have a path, and that for now is enough." The weeks that followed took on a quiet rhythm, not unlike the slow turning of a page. Eleanor and Godfrey met only once more in person, a brief moment in a corner of the botanical gardens, where conversation was shielded by the rustling of tall grasses and the distant clatter of carriage wheels. Their words were few, their silences more telling than speech. The rest was carried by letters, and the letters changed. They no longer danced around the edges of thought. They stepped inside it. Godfrey wrote of his childhood, of a nursemaid who sang lullabies in a dialect no one else in his family understood. He spoke of the first time he realized how little control he had over the shape his life was meant to take. At 10 years old, when his uncle explained the difference between affection and duty, Eleanor replied with stories of her own, of sneaking novels into her Latin lessons, of overhearing her mother once say, in a voice not meant to be heard. Eleanor is clever, yes, but cleverness makes a girl difficult to place. Of the sensation of shrinking inside a corset, not just in body, but in voice. And in between these fragments, they asked each other questions no one else had ever dared to ask them. What would you do if no one were watching? What part of you do you fear others would not forgive? What does it feel like to be brave in your quietest moments? Eleanor kept each letter tied with silk ribbon and hidden in the false bottom of her sewing box. She took them out only at night, reading by the faintest glow of her oil lamp, the paper warm from her hands, the words stitched into her mind like a second skin. Her mother noticed, of course. She always noticed. "Your thoughts seem far away lately," Mrs. Marston remarked one morning as they arranged flowers in the parlor. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor replied without looking up. "No, not unwell, only changing." Her mother's hand stilled. "Do be careful with that, Eleanor. Change invites scrutiny, and scrutiny leaves little room for grace." Eleanor said nothing. She merely adjusted a sprig of lilac and moved on to the next vase. But change had already taken root. It showed in the way she walked, her spine no longer rigid with caution, but held steady by something inward. It showed in her voice when she spoke in company, still soft, still composed, but threaded with a quiet certainty that unsettled more than one afternoon guest. Then one afternoon in early June, Godfrey's letter did not arrive, nor did it come the next day, or the next. At first, Eleanor told herself it was merely delay, a missed post, a lost envelope. But by the fourth day, something in her began to close, not with anger, but with a dull, cold clarity. By the sixth day, she found herself staring at the spot on her desk where the letters usually rested, her fingers resting motionless on the unopened pages of a novel. She told herself not to leap to conclusions, but the stillness around her felt different this time, not like a pause, more like a retreat. And then, on the evening of the seventh day, a letter did come. But it was not from Godfrey. It was from Lady Winterbourne. Written in her ornate, almost ornamental hand, the note was short and formal. "Dear Mrs. Marston, you will no doubt have been aware of the acquaintance between Mr. Godfrey Blakemore and your daughter, Miss Eleanor Marston. I write now to inform you, as a courtesy and out of respect for propriety, that Mr. Blakemore will soon be engaged to Miss Catherine Ashcombe of Hertfordshire, whose family and fortune are well known to our circle. There will be an announcement later this month. We ask, of course, for discretion and trust that all parties will understand the necessity of such arrangements in the interest of family duty. Yours sincerely, Lady Evangeline Winterbourne." Eleanor read it once, then again. Then she folded it with care and placed it on the mantelpiece, where the evening light caught the gold of the embossed crest. Her mother said nothing. There was nothing to say. Later, in the quiet of her room, Eleanor did not cry. Not because she was not hurt, but because grief did not always arrive as a storm. Sometimes it came gently, like dusk. She sat at her desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote, "Godfrey, if this is the last time I write to you, let me leave you with this. I was never yours to lose, nor were you mine to claim. What we had was not a possession, but a window. You showed me something that made me feel alive, and for that, I thank you. I do not blame you for choosing what was required of you. I only ask that you do not pretend what passed between us was nothing, because it was not. Be well, be honest, and when you can, be kind to the part of you that still dreams." She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in her drawer, not to be sent, just to exist. Because some letters were meant only for the person she had been when she wrote them. And Eleanor, as she sat in the fading light, realized that she had already become someone else. Summer in London had a peculiar way of softening even the sharpest edges. The city's usual gloom lifted, revealing streets golden in the late afternoon, where shadows grew long and slow across stone steps and market stalls hummed with the scent of apricots, bread, and flowers warming in the sun. Eleanor moved through it all with the grace of someone who had learned to walk while wounded. She did not speak of the letter from Lady Winterbourne, not to Clara, not to Lizzie, and certainly not to her mother, who had accepted the news with the solemn quiet of someone who had long expected it. There were no accusations, no sighs of sympathy, only a new invitation placed discreetly on the breakfast table and a reminder that Eleanor would do well to accept it. There will be other suitors, Mrs. Marston said lightly, pouring tea into fine china. The Ashcombe girl was always better positioned, even if she does talk like a governess. Eleanor stirred her tea without lifting her eyes. I'm not sure I want other suitors. Nonsense, her mother said, folding her napkin. What you want isn't always what matters. The days passed without incident. Eleanor attended the usual gatherings, garden teas with girls who spoke in clipped laughter, Sunday services with stiff bonnets and murmured hymns, and the occasional afternoon call where young men asked questions they never listened to the answers of. But she was different now. Not outwardly. Her posture was as straight, her words as careful, her gloves as perfectly stitched. Yet inside something had shifted. The part of her that once waited to be chosen had grown quiet. Not bitter, not broken, simply still. She no longer searched the crowd when she entered a room, no longer wondered if a letter would arrive. The ache had dulled into something else, something deeper than sadness, a kind of clarity. One morning, as she walked alone through the edge of St. James's Park, she paused beneath an ancient oak and looked out over the water. A swan drifted slowly across the surface, its reflection broken by ripples. She found herself remembering Godfrey's voice, not the words, but the way he spoke them, the weight he gave to silence, the gentleness beneath his reserve. He had not written back, not even once. She did not know if he had read her final letter, the one she never sent, the one folded still in her drawer, but it didn't matter now. She had written it. That was enough. A soft wind stirred the hem of her dress, and she stepped away from the tree, resuming her walk. That afternoon, she returned home to find Clara waiting in the parlor, her face lit with mischief and excitement. There's news, Clara said, bounding up from the settee. About Cousin Rosalind. Eleanor smiled faintly. Another engagement? No, Clara said, eyes wide. She's joined the Women's Reading Society in Islington. They're publishing essays about reform and travel. Eleanor blinked. Rosalind? She sent us a copy of their latest journal. There's an article by a woman who walked the coast of Cornwall alone. Alone, Eleanor. They're calling it Exploration by a Lady's Foot. Isn't that wonderful? Eleanor took the thin pamphlet from Clara's hands and read the title slowly. The print was modest, the paper rough, but the words glowed. A sudden, inexplicable emotion rose in her chest. Not envy, not longing, something quieter, possibility. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual hush, Eleanor returned to her room, lit the oil lamp, and pulled out a fresh page. She began to write, not to Godfrey, not to anyone she knew, just to the empty space waiting beyond her window. There is more than one life available to a girl who dares to see it. There are paths not lit by chandeliers or lined with suitors. There are voices beyond parlors. And maybe mine belongs to that world, even if I don't yet know how to reach it. I do not wish for revenge. I do not even wish for him to regret me. I only wish to walk without pretending. She paused, letting the ink dry, then added, if no one asks who I am, I will ask it of myself. When she finished, she did not fold the paper away. She left it on the desk, bare and open, lit by the small flame flickering beside her. Outside, the city exhaled into dusk. And Eleanor, sitting quietly in her own stillness, was no longer waiting for an answer. The next morning brought with it a mist that clung to the hedgerows and blurred the outlines of rooftops. It was not a cold mist, but it gave the air a softness, as though the world had been dipped in pale silk. Eleanor woke early, her thoughts unusually clear. The letter she had written the night before still lay unfolded on her desk, its presence like a quiet guest in the room. She did not touch it. Instead, she dressed herself in a modest walking gown of slate green and pulled her hair into a loose chignon, allowing a few wisps to remain untamed at her neck. The mirror reflected a version of herself that was neither composed nor unraveled, simply present, awake. Downstairs, breakfast passed without mention of her plans. Her mother read aloud from a new invitation list while her father turned the pages of his newspaper with the kind of distracted disapproval that was his usual contribution to the domestic rhythm. I've accepted for the Hastings garden party, Mrs. Marston said, sipping her tea. It will be a good showing this year. Lord Norwich has promised a string quartet and doves. Eleanor nodded, but said nothing. By late morning, she had made her way to the Reading Society in Islington. The building was small, tucked between a milliner's and a chemist. its windows half obscured by potted herbs and a modest lace curtain. The sign above the door read Islington Women's Circle for Letters and Reform, the words painted in soft, worn gold. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, not from fear, but from the unusual feeling that this decision might matter in ways she could not yet see. Then she opened the door. Inside, the scent of parchment and lavender hung in the air. A tall woman with streaks of gray in her braids sat at a table near the window, arranging pamphlets with long, deliberate fingers. She looked up as Eleanor entered, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "May I help you?" she asked. "I." Eleanor paused, then lifted her chin slightly. "I'm not here on anyone's behalf. I read your publication. I'd like to know more." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and gestured to a nearby chair. "We're not a club for idle pastimes," she said. "We write, we study, and we speak plainly. Some ladies don't return after the first week." "I'm not afraid of words," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "Good," the woman said. "Then let's begin with yours." For the next hour, Eleanor sat among women she had never seen before, widows, governesses, merchant daughters, none of whom curtsied, none of whom asked about her family's estate or the quality of her linen. They asked instead what she believed and what she had read, and what she had always wanted to say but never been permitted to. At first, Eleanor said little. She listened. She watched the way they carried themselves, not with grandeur, but with a kind of quiet self-assurance that seemed to radiate from the inside out. When she finally did speak, her voice trembled only slightly. "I once thought I wanted to be chosen," she said, "but I've come to believe I want to choose." A silence followed her words, not judgmental, just still. Then the gray-braided woman nodded. "That's a beginning." When she left the building, the mist had lifted. The sun had broken through in thin bands, casting long gold streaks across the pavement. Eleanor stepped into the light with no clear direction, but a profound sense of motion. Something inside her was moving now, forward, outward, away from the confines of parlors and letters never answered. That evening, as she returned home, she passed the open gate to Bloomsbury Gardens. For a brief moment, her feet slowed. The memory of the bench beneath the elm stirred at the edge of her thoughts, but she did not turn in. She did not need to visit the ghost of a promise that had never fully taken shape. Instead, she walked on. At home, she wrote again, not to anyone, but to the page. "I thought I had lost something, but perhaps what I lost was not mine to keep. Perhaps it was only meant to show me where the door had always been. There is a life outside of the drawing room. I have seen it. I have stepped toward it. And with each word I write, I leave behind the version of me who waited in silence." She laid down her pen and left the letter unsealed. Because it wasn't an ending, it was an opening. The days that followed unfolded not with sudden revelation, but with quiet, deliberate change. Eleanor returned to the Reading Society twice a week, walking the familiar path through Islington with Lizzie at a respectful distance. Each time she stepped more easily into the rooms where women spoke with uncloaked conviction, where thoughts were not measured in whispers, but offered in full voice, sometimes even delightfully with disagreement. There was something both humbling and invigorating in discovering how little she had been permitted to express and how much she still had to learn. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words no longer wavered at the edge of apology. She no longer dressed for approval. She wore simpler gowns now, often of soft linen, her hair gathered loosely at her nape, and she carried a satchel of notes and ink instead of a reticule. At home, her mother observed these changes with quiet displeasure. "You're walking too much," Mrs. Marston said one morning, her tone light but clipped. "Your cheeks are becoming wind-pinked. It gives the impression of a governess." "I don't mind the wind," Eleanor replied, spreading marmalade on toast. "And your hair," her mother added, eyeing the coiled braid. "You no longer dress it properly. It is comfortable this way." "That's not the point," Mrs. Marston said, setting her cup down. "Comfort does not build a future." Eleanor did not argue. There was no use trying to explain that her idea of the future no longer lived within her mother's definitions. Instead, she turned her attention to a small pamphlet folded in her lap, an article by a woman from Bristol who had started a school for girls using discarded ledgers and chalk. That evening, Eleanor climbed to the attic and opened the long unused trunk that had once held old holiday ribbons and unwanted gifts. From beneath the dust-covered lining, she pulled out her childhood books, dog-eared copies of stories she once devoured under the covers with a candle stub. Fables, travelogues, and one tattered volume about a girl who disguised herself as a printer's apprentice and sailed to the Americas. She sat cross-legged on the floor, turning the pages slowly, each word familiar, though read now with different eyes. How strange, she thought, that she had once needed permission to imagine. Now she claimed it without asking. Then, without quite intending to, she returned to her desk and opened a new page in her journal. I have begun to write again, not for him, not even for myself, but for the girl I was before I learned to sit quietly at tea tables. I write to her now, and I tell her, you were not wrong to dream of something wider than the parlor. They said you must wait. That love, that life, that meaning would arrive only if summoned properly, if you stood still long enough and looked pleasing. But they were mistaken. The world will not come to you, child. You must walk into it, even if your hem gets dirty, even if no one holds your hand. There was a knock on her door then, soft and hesitant. Clara stepped in, barefoot, her nightgown trailing behind her like a whisper. She held a folded sheet of paper. This came for you, she said, her voice unusually subdued. It was slipped under the front door. Lizzie didn't see who left it. Eleanor took the paper, her breath caught between fingers. Her eyes scanned the page. There was no signature, no greeting, only a single line written in a hand she had not seen in nearly a month. I have made a mistake. She folded the note slowly. Clara watched her with wide, waiting eyes. Will you write back? She asked. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out over the city, its chimneys rising like quiet sentinels into the dusk. The light had changed. The clouds were parting. Somewhere below, a carriage clattered over cobblestones. She could smell the faintest trace of coal smoke and honeysuckle. I don't know yet, she said. And it was true. Once she would have run to reply, would have wept or smiled or folded the note into her heart like a prayer. But now she was different, not hardened, not distant, just whole. She tucked the note into a drawer and returned to her desk. And for the rest of the night, she wrote. Not a reply, a beginning. By the following morning, the note still rested in the drawer, untouched. Eleanor rose early, not out of unrest, but with the strange calm of someone who had already made a decision, even if she had not yet named it. She washed, dressed, and pinned her hair up with deliberate care, not in the usual obedient knots of her mother's preference, but swept into a style that was her own, unfussy, strong, and practical. Breakfast passed quietly. Her father discussed a dispute over railway shares with his usual air of weary detachment. Her mother commented on Mrs. Winslow's new bonnet with subtle disapproval. And Clara, sensing something unspoken, watched Eleanor with the soft curiosity of one who suspects change but does not know how to ask after it. Eleanor did not bring up the note. By noon, she had returned to Islington, to the modest door with its gold letters now as familiar to her as her own name. The room inside felt warmer than usual. The windows were open, and a breeze played gently with the edges of pamphlets on the table. There were fewer women present today, but the sense of focus, of shared pursuit, was no less keen. The gray-braided woman, whom Eleanor now called Miss Alcott, greeted her with a nod and slid a thin stack of pages across the table. We're printing a new issue, she said. Would you care to contribute? Eleanor looked at the papers. At first glance, they were nothing extraordinary. Essays on reform, short pieces on women's property law, a poem about the Thames. But as her eyes moved down the list, something tightened in her chest. You want me to write something? She asked softly. Miss Alcott met her gaze. I want your voice on the page. We publish truth, and I've seen yours, even if you haven't named it yet. It took Eleanor the rest of the day to decide what to say. She walked through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, pausing at every little shop window, every chimneyed row house, not because she needed anything, but because she was searching for a place in her own mind where the fear had no purchase. That evening, seated at her desk with a single candle burning low, she began. What does it mean to be known in a world that only sees the outline of you? I have been shaped, not by who I am, but by what others expected of me. I have been praised for silence and composure, but rarely for thought. Once I believed my worth depended on being chosen, but now I know to choose oneself is the more radical thing. To name what you desire, to claim space where none was offered. This is not a tale of heartbreak, it is a story of waking. She signed the piece with her initials only, EM. No title, just words. When she handed the pages to Miss Alcott the next day, there was no grand declaration, no speech, just the exchange of paper and a quiet nod between women who understood the power of a sentence spoken at the right time. The following week, her piece appeared in print. She held the small bound issue in her hands with reverence and disbelief. Her words were there, printed in black ink, nestled between pieces written by women she admired. The weight of the booklet was barely more than a letter, but it felt heavier than any she had ever received. She tucked a copy into her satchel and carried it with her for days. She did not tell her mother. Instead, she carried it with the quiet pride of someone who had at last written herself into existence. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after the publication, that Lizzie returned from town with another note. This one, unlike the last, was sealed in familiar wax and marked only with a single initial. Eleanor took it upstairs, her steps steady. She sat on her bed before breaking the seal. Eleanor, I saw your words in the society's paper. I read them twice, then a third time, and each time I understood more. I want to say I am sorry, not for my silence, though I do regret it, but for failing to believe that I could choose something different than what was handed to me. You did not just see through the curtain, you stepped beyond it. And I lingered too long, afraid of what lived on the other side. I am not writing to ask you back. I am writing to thank you. You changed the way I see the world, and perhaps in time I will learn how to move through it more honestly. With quiet admiration, Godfrey admiration. She read the letter once, then again, and folded it without weeping. She did not need it. It was not an answer she had waited for. It was simply a recognition. Later that night, Eleanor returned to her writing table, lit the lamp, and pulled out another page. Her pen hovered over the blank sheet for a long moment before she began again. Not to him, to herself. I am not waiting anymore. July arrived with a sun that rose earlier each morning and lingered long past supper, casting the Marston house in long, slanting light that filtered through curtains and stretched across floorboards like ribbons. The city, restless in its summer skin, grew louder, livelier. Markets bustled later into the evening, music echoed from open windows, and the scent of warm stone and honeysuckle lay thick in the air. Eleanor found herself walking more. Not with purpose, always. Not in the way she had once walked to meet a letter or fulfill a duty. Now her walks took her along back lanes, to used bookstalls tucked between bakeries, to the edge of canals where boys shouted from rowboats and the water shimmered like glass broken gently across the surface. She wandered through parks without stopping, through neighborhoods that whispered of lives she had never imagined. Seamstresses gossiping on balconies, laundresses with chapped hands hanging out sheets that rippled like flags of quiet rebellion. She walked as though she were learning the city anew, and perhaps she was. The Reading Society continued its quiet revolution. Eleanor's piece had stirred more responses than she expected. 2 letters from women in Bristol and York, another from a widow in Surrey who had never written for publication, but sent a folded scrap of paper that read simply, I see myself in your words. Miss Alcott had placed the note beside the others on the small corkboard near the front door, beneath the heading, Voices Answered. Eleanor had not realized until then how deeply she had longed to be heard. That week, she contributed again. Not an essay this time, but a letter to an anonymous reader. She wrote of the strange, tender ache of becoming, of what it felt like to unfasten the quiet lies one had worn like silk gloves. Graceful, comfortable, and entirely too tight. She signed it EM again. One day, while writing in the library of the society, she heard a knock at the door. When Miss Alcott stepped out to answer it, Eleanor remained in her seat, ink still wet on her page. A moment later, a voice came low from the hall. Is Miss Eleanor Marston here? It was a man's voice, familiar, measured. Eleanor's hand stopped mid-sentence. Miss Alcott's reply was brisk. She is, but unless your message is written or urgent, she is occupied. There was a pause. Then, please give her this. A paper, folded. Steps retreating. Miss Alcott returned a moment later and laid the paper beside Eleanor without comment. Eleanor waited until the door closed before unfolding it. The letter was brief. You owe me no answer, but I find I cannot leave London without trying once more to say what I could not before. I am not who I thought I was, not because I lost you, but because I watched you become yourself, and I realized I had never begun. I am leaving for the coast. My family believes it is for business, but I go to unlearn. If I ever write again, it will be as someone different. With humility, Godfrey's asked. She stared at the page for a long time, her breath even, not sorrowful, not elated, just still. She folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of her notebook. Then she picked up her pen and returned to her unfinished sentence. And still the world waits, not with judgment, but with open hands. That evening, Eleanor returned home as the sky blushed deep orange. Clara was in the parlor, sprawled across the rug reading a novel with a dreamy look in her eyes. Their mother was arranging lilies in the vase by the mirror, sighing at the slight browning of their edges. Tomorrow, she said without looking up, you'll accompany me to tea with the Thistlethwaites. Their son has returned from Oxford. Eleanor unpinned her hat and set it gently on the hook. Her voice was quiet but steady. No, thank you. Mrs. Marston turned. The lily stem paused in midair. I beg your pardon? I won't go, Eleanor said. I'm meeting with Miss Alcott. We're reviewing drafts for next month's edition. There was a silence that filled the room like smoke. You are not a writer, her mother said. I wasn't, Eleanor replied, but I am now. She did not stay for argument. She went to her room, lit her lamp, and opened her notebook. She began to write about maps, how most of the ones she'd seen showed countries and capitals, but none charted the internal terrain of becoming. None marked the places where a girl might unlearn silence. None traced the path of a heart finding its own shape. She would write that map, piece by piece, not for someone else to follow, but because it was hers. The days grew longer still, and the heat settled over the city like a soft, relentless hush. In the late afternoons, when the sun angled low and turned every window pane into a sheet of gold, Eleanor found herself walking less and writing more. The quiet of her room became a haven, not a prison, filled with the rustle of paper, the soft clink of her inkwell, and the fluttering thoughts that now moved more freely from her mind to the page. The Reading Society had asked for a feature column, something ongoing, something in her voice. They wanted her to write letters addressed not to any one person, but to the quiet women reading by lamplight after children were asleep, after the day had wrung them dry. Letters that would speak to what it meant to think, to long, to wait, and finally, to step. Eleanor hesitated for a day, then agreed. She called the series To She Who Stands at the Door. In it, she wrote of stillness, not as surrender, but as preparation, of the ache of uncertainty, of the peculiar loneliness that came from choosing truth in a world shaped by arrangement. She never spoke of Godfrey by name, but between her lines was the ghost of that first meeting, that careful walk through Gunnersbury Park, the shape of a bench beneath an elm tree, and always, always, the hush that came after, the silence not of loss, but of learning. The responses to the letters arrived quickly, often unsigned, many with only a single sentence. You have spoken the thing I could not. I did not know I was allowed to think this way. Please write again. I am still listening. She kept every reply, tucked them into a small wooden box lined with velvet that Clara had given her on a birthday long ago. The same box that once held ribbons and secret wishes. Now it held truths. One afternoon, Clara found her sorting through the pile and leaned in, curious. Why don't you sign your full name? She asked. Wouldn't it be grand for them to know it's you? Eleanor smiled faintly. It isn't about me. Clara tilted her head. But it's your voice. Yes, Eleanor said. But the voice belongs to more than just one person. It's the part of all of us that never had space before. Clara grew quiet then, folding herself on the settee beside the writing desk. She was 13 now, just beginning to feel the slow draw of society's shaping hands. She watched her sister with something between admiration and yearning. I think I want to write too, she said suddenly. Eleanor turned to her. Then write. Start today. I don't know what to say. Then begin with what you wish someone had said to you. Clara grinned, wide and genuine, and rushed off to fetch paper. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered awake across the city, and the windows glowed in yellow constellations, Eleanor sat at her desk and began the next installment of her series. She paused first to open a new letter that had arrived just after supper. The paper was coarse, the hand unfamiliar. No return address. Miss E.M., I read your piece aloud to my mother. She wept, not from sadness, but because someone had at last spoken the thing she buried. She asked me to write on her behalf, to say thank you. She says your words were like hearing her own thoughts in another voice. That's a kind of healing, I think. Please keep writing. It was signed simply, a daughter. Eleanor held the letter for a long moment. Then she took up her pen and began the next letter. To she who has been asked to be smaller, your voice is not too loud. Your questions are not unkind. Your longing is not a flaw. You have not failed because you paused. You have not missed your chance because you did not rush. Some doors must be built before they are opened. Some awakenings are quiet. You are not behind. You are only just beginning. She stopped only once when the candle flickered low and her hand ached from writing, but her heart was steady. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, Eleanor wrote not with sorrow, but with power. For the first time in her life, she was no longer seeking a place. She was making one. August brought with it a gentler heat, the kind that no longer pressed itself against window panes or stole the air from parlors, but rather drifted like silk through open shutters. The city softened, slowing in its footsteps, its tempers. In the mornings, the bells from the nearby chapel chimed with a sweetness that made Eleanor pause in her writing, just to listen. By then, the reading society had grown. Word of Eleanor's column, To She Who Stands at the Door, had spread beyond Islington. Submissions poured in from Edinburgh, Bath, even as far as Dublin. Some came as full essays, others as poems or sketches, written on the backs of bills or bits of old ledger paper. A few were stories written not to entertain, but to confess. Quiet rebellions, long-held regrets, small victories hidden behind aprons and wedding bands. Miss Alcott began penning the most affecting passages to a growing wall in the main room of the society. She called it The Unfolding. It stretched now from one end of the room to the other, curling into corners like ivy, and on it in the center was the very first line Eleanor had ever written for them. I thought I had lost something, but perhaps what I lost was not mine to keep. Eleanor never stood before the wall when others were watching, but often in the early morning she would arrive before the lamps were lit and read each line again. Sometimes she recognized her own phrasing echoed back to her, refracted through other voices. Sometimes she wept without knowing quite why. She no longer lived for letters from Godfrey. In truth, she had not thought of him in days, except as one might think of a storm long past, a presence remembered more by the change it left behind than by the shape of its thunder. One afternoon, as she returned from the society with a fresh bundle of pages beneath her arm, she passed a familiar shop, a small stationer's with blue trim and sun-faded display cards. It was there, months ago, that she had once bought cream paper and violet ink, hoping to impress with her restraint. She stepped inside. The bell chimed overhead, and the air was still and fragrant with dust and wax. Miss Marston, said the proprietor with a warm nod. A pleasure. It's been some time. She smiled. I'm looking for envelopes and string. He retrieved them without question, but as she laid the coin upon the counter, he hesitated. I've meant to say, he began, your words, they made it to my wife. She's been reading your pages aloud in the evenings. She says they make her feel. He cleared his throat, looking sheepish, less invisible. Eleanor blinked. I didn't know she read them. He nodded. They're passed about quietly, but they're passed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and washed the sky in soft apricot, Eleanor sat by her bedroom window with the new bundle of reader letters. One in particular drew her attention. It was longer than most, written in a tight, careful hand. Dear E.M., I do not know how to describe what has happened to me, except to say that your words reached into a place I had long stopped visiting. They pulled me back to a younger version of myself, the one who once made small rebellions in secret, reading philosophy under a quilt, writing poetry in the margins of schoolwork, dreaming of something more than the walk from hearth to pew. I am older now. My children are nearly grown, but I have decided that I am not finished becoming. You reminded me that no one else must give me permission to begin again. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she rose and returned to her desk. The lamp cast a soft halo across the surface. She pulled a new sheet of paper toward her and wrote the next column. To she who thinks it is too late, time does not diminish your voice. It does not make your longing foolish. You are not past the edge of change. You are precisely where the door begins. You do not need to ask to start again. You only need to name what you still carry and begin walking. She paused, listening to the city exhale outside her window. A bird landed on the sill and fluttered away again. She dipped her pen once more. The story is not over. It never was. You have only now begun to write it with your own hand. September arrived without fanfare, slipping into the city like a breath taken between sentences. The leaves had not yet turned, but the air had changed, cooler in the early mornings and tinged with the scent of earth and chimney smoke. Children returned to school in neat boots and oversized coats, and the markets began selling root vegetables and jars of thick plum preserves. Eleanor watched the seasons shift, as if from a slight distance, not because she felt removed from the world, but because she was so deeply within her own for the first time. Her column had taken on a life of its own, where once she had written in quiet reply to herself, now she wrote in conversation, with strangers, with past versions of herself, with the women she saw in parks or queues or seated quietly behind sewing tables. Her letters were being copied, read aloud in parlors and schools, even discussed at evening societies attended by women who had once sworn never to speak of such things. And yet, Eleanor remained modestly unseen in the formal world. Her name never appeared in print. Her voice, though recognized, was still anonymous in the public sphere, known only by the initials E.M. She preferred it that way. One afternoon, while working at the society, Miss Alcott entered with an envelope in hand. She didn't speak at first, just placed it gently on the table where Eleanor sat reviewing submissions. I think, Miss Alcott said softly, you may wish to read this one alone. Eleanor looked up. It's not from him, is it? No, said Miss Alcott. It's from someone else, someone unexpected. Eleanor took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. The paper was thick, the handwriting uneven but careful. She slipped a letter opener beneath the seal and unfolded the single sheet within. It read, Dear E.M., I am not one of your usual readers. I am not a wife, nor a daughter, nor a widow. I am not a quiet girl dreaming in a parlor, nor a woman who has been forced into stillness. I am a man. I do not write this to intrude. I write because your words found me. I read your letters in the paper my sister left behind when she died this summer. She had bound them with ribbon. She read them each week. She never told me she was writing, but I see now, in the margins of her own letters, the phrases she underlined, the ones she copied. You helped her live more fully in her final year. You gave her language for what she could never speak aloud in our home. And now, oddly, I find you've given me language too. Not for grief exactly, but for the strange silence that follows it. The shape of absence, the need to begin again. I thought you should know what your words have done. Eleanor held the letter in her lap for a long while, hands still. The society buzzed around her with the soft sounds of rustling papers and murmured discussions, but she heard none of it. For the first time since beginning her quiet revolution, she felt the vastness of what had begun to ripple outward. Her words, once whispered in doubt, now moved through grief and healing, beyond parlors and drawing rooms, into places she had never intended, never imagined. She took up her pen again that evening, lit only by the golden dusk falling across her desk. To one who carries grief, I did not expect you, but I am honored to have met you here. You remind me that pain too has a voice, that silence is not always weakness, that remembering someone through the words they loved is a form of keeping them near. You are not lost, you are walking, and even in sorrow, that is a kind of courage. Thank you for showing me that the door opens both ways. When she finished, she did not sign her name. She pressed her hand gently to the page, then blew out the candle. And in the growing dark, she felt something new. Not pride, not even peace, but a stillness rich with meaning. The kind of stillness that comes only when a voice has found its echo. As October crept in, the air turned sharp and dry. The scent of apples and coal smoke drifted through narrow streets, and the trees, at first shy, began to let go of their leaves with a quiet, trembling grace. The sound of carriages grew more hollow on the damp cobblestones, and shop windows dressed themselves in heavier colors, with velvet ribbons and copper buttons, as if the city itself were donning a thicker skin. Eleanor had come to prefer the mornings. They were hers. Before the clatter of teacups and invitations, before her mother's glances turned toward the empty space where a suitor ought to have stood, she found herself most alive in the soft hush of dawn. It was in those hours that she wrote. The letters, now numbering into dozens, had become more than a column. They were a conversation. And in the quiet that filled her room before the fire was lit, she answered women who had never been given a mirror, not one that reflected their fears and strength and questions without judgment. One woman wrote from the outskirts of Manchester, where she worked in a textile house. "I am the only one in the factory who can read. I read your letter aloud each Thursday. They say it makes the day softer." Another from a vicar's wife in Sussex. "You make me brave enough to say I am lonely, and that I am still a whole person, even so. One letter, unsigned, simply read, I walked out the door." It was not loud, but it was the first time I ever walked for myself. Eleanor kept every letter. Sometimes in the late evenings, she would lay them out on her bed like petals and read them one by one, letting the voices fill the space where once she had waited for someone else's voice to call her worthy. It was on one of those evenings, with the chill seeping through the cracks in her window pane, that she noticed her mother standing silently in the doorway. Mrs. Marston's face was unreadable. "You receive a great many letters," she said at last, not unkindly. "More than I thought women ever did outside of courtship." Eleanor did not rise from her seat. "They aren't love letters." "No," her mother said, stepping closer, "but I suspect they come from a place of love nonetheless." A silence passed between them, not sharp but uncertain. Her mother looked down at the edge of the bed, where a letter lay open, a passage marked in dark ink. "I do not know how to tell my daughter that the world is unkind and yet still ask her to hope." Mrs. Marston's hand hovered over the page, then withdrew. "I sometimes wonder," she said softly, "if I failed you by preparing you only to endure." Eleanor looked up at her then, not with accusation, but with something gentler. "You prepared me to survive. That was not nothing." Mrs. Marston sat beside her. "I was told my duty was to raise you properly," she continued, "to make you suitable. But I think now, perhaps I should have taught you to listen to the voice no one else hears, the one that speaks only when the room is quiet." Eleanor folded the letter gently, setting it aside. "You taught me more than you think," she said, "but I had to leave the room to hear the rest." Her mother nodded, eyes distant. "And now others listen to you." "I suppose so," Eleanor said softly, "but I'm still learning how to listen back." Mrs. Marston rose, smoothing the front of her gown. "Keep writing," she said, voice nearly a whisper. "Even if I don't understand all of it, I see what it's doing." When she left the room, the silence that followed felt different than before. It was not the silence of avoidance or expectation. It was permission. That night, Eleanor penned her next letter. To she who is beginning to be heard, it may come softly at first, a nod, a question, a look held a beat longer than before. You may not be applauded, but you will be noticed. And when you are, the world around you may begin to change shape, because your voice, once invisible, has left an imprint. Do not doubt it. A whisper can split a stone, given time. She signed it as always, E.M. And when she set down her pen, the candlelight danced in the curved glass of her inkwell, as if the very room breathed with her. The first frost arrived overnight, quiet and delicate. It etched the garden leaves with silver and turned the windows of the Marston home to lace. When Eleanor stepped into the morning air, the world felt paused, suspended between breath and hush, as if even the city had paused to listen. She had begun to rise earlier now, long before the rest of the house stirred. Her writing, once a private ritual, had become something more structured. Every Wednesday morning, she sent off a fresh letter for the Society's publication, and every Friday she returned with a basket of new responses, readers' notes, essays, fragments of poetry wrapped in ribbons or tucked between the folds of unmarked paper. By now, the Society's columns reached further than anyone had expected. Eleanor's words had been copied and passed among factory halls, stitched into the corners of handkerchiefs, and even cited, albeit anonymously, by a progressive reverend in a sermon on women's wisdom. The name EM had become a kind of password, a thread that linked women in rooms where they had once been silent, and yet she remained apart from the public eye. There were no speeches, no salons. Eleanor did not seek notoriety. What she desired more than ever was the quiet space where truth could be held gently, where no one had to raise their voice to be heard. It was on a frost-bitten morning that she received a parcel, unmarked, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside, carefully folded, was a modest shawl of soft gray wool and a note written in a strong, slanted hand. To EM, your words warmed me more than this ever could, but I hope it brings you a little of what you have given to others. There was no name, no town. Eleanor pressed the wool to her cheek and closed her eyes. She would never know who had sent it, and she did not need to. Later that week, as she walked with Miss Alcott through the narrow side streets of Clerkenwell, passing steam rising from bakeries and chimneys, they stopped before the small bindery where their newest editions were prepared. Miss Alcott turned toward her with something unreadable in her expression. "I've been asked," she said, "whether you would consider publishing the collected letters in full." Eleanor blinked. "All of them?" "Not just yours," Miss Alcott clarified, "but the responses, the whole conversation, as one volume." Eleanor was quiet. She thought of the women who had written from cellars, from vicarages, from corners of kitchens where they scribbled between boiling kettles and sweeping ash. She thought of her own letters, begun in doubt, shaped in solitude. A book, not a column, not a whispered note passed in secret. A book. She nodded slowly. "Yes, if we include them all." Miss Alcott smiled. "We will. Each one has a place." That night, Eleanor wrote again, but this time not for the column, not for the society, for herself. "I once believed that a woman's life was a pattern to follow, a sequence of smiles, silences, and sacrifices. I followed that path for a time, wearing the gowns stitched for me by others, speaking the words that would keep me liked, quiet, acceptable. But I have stepped beyond that drawing now, and in doing so, I have found not only myself, but a multitude of others waiting beyond the edges of the page. We are not a single story. We are a chorus, and I am listening." She folded the page and placed it not in an envelope, but in her journal. Outside, the frost returned, this time clinging even to the iron gate. But Eleanor did not close the window. She let the cold in. She welcomed it. By late November, the frost had deepened into something more permanent. It lined the rooftops and the bare branches with crystalline threads, catching the early morning sun like spun glass. The chimneys of London coughed steadily now, and the scent of coal hung in the streets. At the Marston house, the windows remained shut tight, and even the cat refused to leave the hearth rug. Eleanor no longer minded the cold. She had grown to like the way it clarified everything: the air, the sky, her thoughts. The book was happening. It had taken weeks of quiet labor, sorting, transcribing, editing, but the first proofs had arrived from the bindery, their pages wrapped in soft linen and tied with red string. Eleanor held a copy in her lap on the day it arrived, staring at the title stamped simply in gold leaf on the cover: "To She Who Stands at the Door, Letters from a Quiet Revolution." Her name was not on the cover, but she had written the foreword. It was only a page long. "This book is not mine. It belongs to the women who read by candlelight, who wrote with blunt pencils and blistered hands, who dared to say I think, I feel, I remember. It belongs to the voices stitched into its margins, to those who could not write but who told their stories anyway, aloud, in quiet rooms where someone finally listened. I was only a door. You are the ones who walked through." The first copies were distributed by hand, not to shops, but to parlors, kitchens, and schools. Women passed them between one another like secrets, dog-eared the corners, underlined phrases, and wrote notes in the back. Miss Alcott reported that in some towns, women read the book aloud during sewing circles or after Sunday services, their voices trembling and strong in turns. Clara came to Eleanor's room one evening, holding a copy pressed to her chest. "I want to start a circle," she said, shy but certain, "at the school. Just a few of us, reading together. We're not writers yet, but we want to speak." Eleanor smiled, her eyes warming. "Then begin." They hugged, simply. No speeches, no ceremony. Later that week, Eleanor received a letter. The postmark was unfamiliar, somewhere in the north. It read, I found your book tucked behind a loaf of bread at the market, left on purpose, I think, by someone who wanted it to be found. I read it in a single night. The next morning, I woke before the others and wrote a letter to my sister. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. Your words didn't fix everything, but they reminded me I could begin. Thank you. It was signed again, simply, A Woman Becoming. Eleanor added it to the box. That box had grown too full now. She would need another. The letters had outgrown the space they were first offered, much like the woman who once wrote by candlelight in secret, fearing she had no place. Now, as December crept near, Eleanor walked off into the bindery to oversee the new printings. The streets were cold, the stones slick, but she moved through them without hurry. She had nothing to chase anymore, only something to carry. One evening, as she passed the old elm in Bloomsbury Gardens, she stopped. The bench was still there, empty now, with a trace of frost glinting on the slats. She did not sit, but she stood for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her like the shawl she had once received from a stranger. The tree was bare, but not dead. Its branches reached skyward, black against the fading light. She nodded once, not to anyone in particular, and walked on. That night, Eleanor began a new letter, not for the column, not for the book, for the future. To she who has not yet arrived, we are waiting for you. The door is still open. There is no test to pass, no silence to prove, no rule to obey before you are worthy. You need only step in with your whole self, whatever shape that takes, whatever name you have not yet claimed. We will not ask you to whisper. We will make room for your voice. Winter settled fully over London, wrapping the city in stillness. Snow came at last in early December, soft and persistent, falling in quiet spirals through the gray sky. The city slowed beneath its weight. Markets hushed, footsteps softened, and even the endless clatter of wheels on cobblestones seemed gentler. Frost laced every window pane. Candlelight glowed in every room. And yet, inside the Marston house, the season felt brighter than any before. Clara's reading circle had grown to 12 girls, each one arriving with smudged mittens and paper-wrapped journals, carrying not just books but questions, real ones, about life and future, and how to speak when the world expected silence. They had begun writing their own letters now. Eleanor read them sometimes, marveling at the fierce, searching wisdom in words barely formed. At the Reading Society, Miss Alcott ordered another round of printings. The book had spread faster than they could bind it. Someone had written to say they saw it being read aloud in a post office queue. Another reported a sighting in the back pew of a church, tucked between hymnals. One woman swore she'd found a copy sewn into the lining of a coat headed for Canada. Eleanor never sought to count them. She did not wish to know how many copies had been printed, how many readers had passed her words from hand to hand. That was not the point. The point was the echo, the way a single thought could leave one hand and reach another without ever passing through applause. She spent more time walking now than she once had, through snow-covered paths, down alleys lit with gas lamps, through gardens where frozen fountains stood like sculptures of silence. She walked not to chase but to reflect, not to escape but to witness. On one such walk in the last week before Christmas, she passed a man seated beneath the same elm tree where she and Godfrey had once spoken. He was older, wrapped in a coat patched at the elbow, a small book open in his lap. He looked up and met her eyes only briefly, then tipped his hat and returned to his reading. The cover of the book bore no title now. The gold had worn away. But she knew it. Eleanor smiled softly and kept walking. That evening, back home, she lit the hearth and took out her notebook. There was no deadline now, no column due, no reader waiting on the other side of the page. But she wrote anyway, because the habit had become her home. To she who once waited to be chosen, look at what you built, not a tower, nor a throne, nor a stage, but a room, a wide, warm, listening room where others can come as they are. You did not need to shout to be heard. You did not need to be adored to be true. You were enough the moment you began, not because you were perfect, but because you were honest. And now there are lights in other windows, fires burning on other hearts, letters being written by hands you will never touch, in towns you may never see, because you chose to speak. She stopped writing and closed the notebook. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering rooftops and hedges, sealing the world in gentle white. Eleanor rose, pulled the shawl around her shoulders and stood by the window. She did not long for a letter. She did not search the street. She was not waiting anymore. She was at the center of her own quiet revolution. And far beyond her walls, the voices she had helped to wake were still rising, still writing, still unfolding like winter flowers, tender, strong, and wholly their own.